Rebecca Valcarcel, and I'd like to talk about Trifles by Susan Glaspell. She is a playwright who has won a Pulitzer Prize, plus a novelist, and when she started out, she would be a reporter reporting on murder trials. So that relates to this play. So let's look at the title, Trifles. Trifles means small, insignificant details, and this is exactly what gets noticed by the women in the play and what gets overlooked by the men in the play. So the title is very apt because the men tend to dismiss the small things that the women are paying attention to. And because the men are dismissive of the women themselves and also of this domestic sphere, they're not finding the most crucial evidence, which the women do find because they're looking for these small things. Okay, so who is the dead man? This will help explain a lot about the whole situation. So we're in a farmhouse. The dead man has been strangled with a rope upstairs in the bedroom. The only person known to be up there was his wife, and she is the main suspect. But what kind of man was he, and why would she possibly murder him? Well, we know from the play that he was called Close. One of the women holds up a dress that his wife would wear, or a skirt, and notices that it's shabby and says, John Wright was close, meaning he was stingy with money. So his wife looked shabby, and that actually contributed to her being isolated from her community, because since she couldn't look nice and since he was stingy with money, she couldn't contribute money to a charity and so on. She didn't participate in the life of the town, the social life of other wives and things like that. So she was very isolated, partly because he was stingy with money. And then also, we know that he didn't want a party line telephone. So the reason the body was discovered is that the neighbor, Mr. Hale, was stopping in to say, "Hey, John Wright, would you like to join together and have a party line telephone?" Which in that time period would have been how you could have a telephone, one line shared by many houses. But his wife laughs when she hears that, because John Wright was not a talker. John Wright was not social. He wouldn't have any use for a telephone. And that tells us more about him. And the fact that, not only the stinginess, but the antisocialness would have narrowed their life and prevented them from making friends and having a social circle. It's starting to feel kind of bleak because they also didn't have children. So, yeah, it's just sounding lonely. Okay, another thing he didn't like was noise, because we also know that he killed the canary, probably because it was singing. And we also know that Minnie Foster, his wife, maiden name Foster, used to sing in the choir. And so the fact that he kills the canary, because we have the bird cage with a broken door, the door was opened so harshly that one of the hinges is broken. So he must have ripped open that door and grabbed the canary and wrung its neck. That's the scenario that the women put together when they see the dead bird and they see the cage. So we know John Wright was the kind of man who would kill a canary for singing. And that sounds kind of chilling, right? In other places, he's described as being a good man. So in society's eyes, he's fine. He may not be kind. He may not be good to his wife. He may not be good to animals. He might be almost cruel, but that's not a crime, right? And as long as he pays his debts and mostly, conducts himself okay in town, doesn't lie a lot or cheat or something, then people see him as a good person. But the fact is, we know that he wasn't very good to his wife. Now, is that a reason to murder him? Okay, no. Obviously, Minnie Foster was desperate by the time she bought this canary, and the canary was like the one happy thing in her life that she could care for and that would bring some beauty and song. and he killed it. So that triggered her to murder him. And we can see how that would make her snap. Not that it's right, of course, but we can understand her motives when we see what kind of man he was. So what else about her? Let's talk about the wife, Minnie Foster Wright. We know from the neighbor, Mrs. Hale, that she used to sing in the choir. So she used to sing just like the bird, and she was silenced by this kind of isolation life with him, just like the bird was silenced by him. What else about her? Because of her shabby dress and so on, she couldn't participate in the social life of the town, as we've said. So her life seems very sad, lonely. Okay, so we've pretty much covered her when we covered him. Let's look at symbols now in the play. So obviously the bird cage comes to mind because the cage is similar to her marriage and that house. The house itself too is isolated. It's off from the road. It's down in a hollow. So the house could be a symbol of itself, but the bird cage in particular reminds us of how constricted the life was of Minnie Foster, Minnie Wright. And the bird itself, having been killed, is her, really. It's a symbol of her life and her potential and what was strangled by this marriage. And then we need to talk about the quilt. So when the women are, sitting and kind of waiting for the men to do all their important work upstairs and at the barn, they find that she was piecing a quilt. So she was sewing, and they notice that the nice even sewing is disturbed at one point, and it gets all messy and uneven. So something must have rattled her, right? Maybe it was when the bird was killed that she tried to go back to her sewing, but it was all crooked. So that becomes a symbol of her agitation and her upsetness, but as well, the particular pattern of quilt she's piecing together is the log cabin pattern. And that is a pattern that has a red square at the middle, which is supposed to be the warmth, the hearth, the fire, which is at the center of the home. And then the logs, there are bars of fabric that go around it and make a square. So a symbol of the home that should have at its center warmth and heat, right? The red square in the middle. And, Minnie's life wasn't like that. Their home was not like that. They lacked the warmth that a home ought to have. So this lifeless house and, a life of coldness is represented by the log cabin square that she can create it in sewing, but she can't have it in her life. Okay, one more thing about the quilt. A couple of times there's a discussion about the women say, well, I wonder if she was going to quilt it or knot it. Meaning, was she going to take the whole top of the quilt and sew it to the stuffing, the batting, and then a back with threading it through? Or was she going to knot it? Meaning to just put a yarn through and then tie it off and then add another space, a little space, and then do that again. So you have knots in a pattern across the quilt to hold the pieces together. So was she going to quilt it or knot it? And the men snicker and make fun of this, like, oh, what an important question, la la. Well, it is actually rather important because the knotting of the quilt reflects the knotting of the rope around her husband's neck. And so when the women say at the end, well, we decided she was going to knot it, they're actually not talking so much about the quilt anymore as about what she did with the rope and her husband. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is the transformation of Mrs. Peters. She's the sheriff's wife. She changes the most in the play. Now that we understand what happened before the investigation of the murder, right, this marriage and what it was like, we can see how there's room for compassion to grow for the murderess, right, across the play. In the reader's mind, the viewer's mind, and also in Mrs. Peters' mind. So when Mrs. Peters arrives, she, being the wife of a sheriff, she says things like, well, the law's the law, and, well, the men are being rude to us because they have, big things on their mind. she's making excuses for them and how the men are dismissive of the women. She's saying, well, they have important things to do. She is kind of siding with them with the main societal view of women. And she's quite sure that if the wife killed her husband, then, well, she should just face justice, and that's the end of it. But as she understands more and more about Minnie Wright's life, she starts to change. She realizes, gosh, I too have suffered at the hands of men because I had a cat killed by a boy in childhood, and oh, I just could have killed that boy. She kind of stops herself from saying she could have killed the boy, but she knows how cruel that was and how hard it was to endure. She knows stillness, she says, like the loneliness and the isolation. She remembers a time when they were living in an isolated place and on the land in the Dakotas, and she lost her son, who was 2 years old, and she was very lonely at that point because it was her only child. So she can imagine what it would be like to have the bird be the only thing in your life and have it killed. It's not an excuse because, the law is the law. Murder is not condoned. And yet we're starting to understand the motive and even just the conditions around the marriage. And Mrs. Peters is feeling more and more compassion for the Minnie Foster Wright, the murderess. And it's so much that by the end, she's willing to hide the bird. She's willing to hide the clues that they've found. So the women decide kind of silently that they won't tell the men about the quill to the bird cage. They've decided to hide that. And why would they do that? It seems like Mrs. Hale might have done that all along, but Mrs. Peters, being married to the law, married to the sheriff, her identity is very much tied to being the wife of the sheriff and being kind of buying into the hierarchy that exists in this time period with men and women, her role. She's not supposed to, stir up anything or stand up for herself in some way. She's supposed to be quiet. And actually, the sheriff, by trusting her, is kind of assuming that she can't do anything. She would never hide anything. She doesn't have those kinds of complicated thoughts. Thinking of her as a child almost more than a full adult, to assume that he can just trust her and she'll never do anything that she would hide from him. But actually she does. I mean, it seems like he's right at first and that she is that way, but by the end, she has changed. She feels a solidarity with Minnie Foster Wright and with Mrs. Hale, who all along has been kind of resisting the men's rude dismissiveness in the way that, the men just kind of brush them off and ignore them. So Mrs. Hale all along has been saying, wait a second. But Mrs. Peters is now realizing, yeah, wait a second. So the women come together, really all three of the women come together to protect Mrs. Wright from probably a harsher sentence. I mean, I suppose in the courtroom they're still going to find her guilty. There's no evidence of a break-in where some stranger came in and killed John Wright. But maybe without a motive, without that knowing about the bird, the jury may not be able to give her as heavy a sentence, or maybe they won't convict her at all. But definitely the women have come together to protect each other. And this may seem, underhanded, and it is. It is hiding evidence. It is a secret that they've decided to keep together. But it's also just an act of rebellion. It's an act of rebellion against the structure that has disempowered them, all of them, in setting them up to be side characters, right? Or dismissed in their own importance and independence. They've all suffered from, being women in a time when women were not taken seriously. So maybe it's almost just for them to withhold this peace, or maybe it's not, but it shows the desperation of having to live with a narrowed life, having to live with always being demeaned and thought of as childish and not given respect. It gets to you. And I'll remind you too that Susan Glaspell was in her 40s before women were given the right to vote. So we're talking about a time period pretty restrictive for women. We have to take that into account too. Okay, let me say one more thing, and that is that Mrs. Hale, the neighbor, feels that it was a crime for her to not come visit Minnie Wright once in a while, that she could have reached out to this woman who she now recognizes was suffering in her loneliness, in her isolation. She could have come over. And she says, who's going to punish that crime? You know, there are other crimes. Who's going to punish John Wright for treating his wife badly? Nobody, you know. But the law is set up to definitely punish Minnie Wright for killing her husband, which it should be, you know, of course. Morally speaking, right? She should not have done that. But there are lesser crimes too that are going to go unpunished. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed discussing trifles with me here, and I'd be curious to know what you think. You can leave comments in the comments, and please like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying the stuff I talk about, mostly literature. Join me next time.